Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of these end times. Every year on this date, at least for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been celebrating my anniversary because 10 years ago today, July the 31st, 2008, I posted my very first video to YouTube. And it was about the meaning of the number 666. And on these anniversary dates, I try to do something a little different for your benefit and for my own benefit, to kind of take a break and to mark the beginning of a new year as far as my uploading videos go. And about 35 years before that first date, in other words, back in the early 70s, I had just started working at Ethan Allen Furniture. And on weekends, I would very often take a break and play the piano. I was trained to play the piano when I was in high school, or actually before that. And I remember on this particular day, I wanted to learn how to play Chopin's Waltz in C-sharp minor, one of my favorite pieces. And I was playing along, and after the first, I think, 16 bars, he suddenly changes key, and I think he had it at the beginning in 4 sharps. He switches to 5 flats, if I remember correctly. And I said, this is crazy. I mean, I always hated to play sharps and flats anyway. And so it occurred to me, there's got to be a better way. And that was the start of a new musical notation. And I worked about 10 years on it. And after that, I got into sculpture more, and then, and of course, around 2001, I retired from Ethan Allen. I got into Bible prophecy. So my new music notation system, which I call Gabriel music notation after the archangel, I have kind of put it on the back burner, but maybe it's time to bring it back out again. Now, at the time that I formulated my new system, it got quite a bit of attention, and probably most musicians have forgot about it since then. But I thought I would show you some of the magazines that it appeared in. I would submit an article to a music magazine, and more often than not, they would publish it. And now this magazine is called MuseArt. I guess you can see that. And this is the winter 1974. So that tells you about when I started this project. And the title is called Something Borrowed, Something New. And it's really, I was very pleased with it. And they actually gave me a better coverage, and I'll show you in a few minutes. The next magazine that covered it was the School Music News. This is the August 1975 issue, a new musical notation. I think you can see that. Nice coverage. 2 pages, actually more than 2 pages. The next magazine that covered it was Piano Guild Notes, and this is October 1975, an improved system of music notation. I was very pleased with all of these, and I did get some attention. I mean, people would read these articles and write me letters, and some of them, and I published a book shortly after this, and quite a few ordered the book, and I will show you what that looks like in a minute. Here is another copy of MuseArt, another edition. This was about a year later. This was the fall of 75, and a very nice copy of it called Details of a New System of Musical Notation by William Tapley. Look at how big they printed my name there. Isn't that something? Anyway, at the time I was excited with all this. Now this is probably my most famous printing. This was Contemporary Keyboard Magazine, very popular at the time among keyboard artists, and this was one of their first editions. It was called Contemporary Keyboard then, and it has a young Herbie Hancock on the cover. I think they changed the name to Keyboard shortly after that, and it was a mainstay for all pianists for, I guess, 41 years. Now last year, I believe they stopped the print edition. I think they merged with another company, so you can't find this anymore on the newsstands. But at the time that this was printed, this was really quite a coup for me. And as you can see, they did me up brown as well. Didn't they do a great job? So that was a real thrill for me. And now this is August of 1976. Southwestern musician combined with Texas music educator. They also gave me quite a bit of publicity, covered the new music notation. Here is the school musician, director, and teacher. This was August, September of 1985. Now, this is about 10 years later. I was still working at it, but I was going at it from different perspectives, trying all the while to promote my system. And I began submitting it to magazines again and again. And then once again, they were very interested. As you can see, very nice article. And this is the last one that I had printed. This was March 1988. And as I say, in the early 90s, I switched and I became interested in sculpture. But at this time, I was still working on my Gabriel music notation, a proposal for progress. Again, I was very pleased with all this notation. So as you can see, all of these articles, so as you can see, I got a lot of publicity at the time, and quite a few people corresponded with me, and we talked about it a great deal. And I found out that it is a hard nut to crack, the music industry and printing music. Because whenever I wrote to publishers, music publishers, they would not dream of publishing music in a new system. I would have to go. I figured at the time, I finally decided that I would have to start a music school to prove to people that my system was far superior to the standard notation. Our standard notation was invented by a Benedictine monk by the name of Guido d'Arezzo, almost 1,000 years ago in Italy. And it took a long time for Europe to accept it. The countries in Northern Europe, they wouldn't accept it for 400 years. They said, what good can come out of Italy? But eventually they did. They had to. Because without music notation, there would be no Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, or Wagner, or Tchaikovsky, or any great conductor. Because before that, music consisted of folk music, one or two instruments. And that was it, because everybody memorized music. There was no way to transcribe it from one generation to another. But of course, since the invention of, since Guido d'Arezzo invented music notation, that enabled music to expand into the great orchestras that we have today. However, there are a lot of problems with Guido's notation system, and I'm going to show you the problems. And I'm going to compare them for you. And on the top here, I have an example of what I call Guidonian notation. This is standard notation. And the exact same passage is printed out below. Let's take a closer look. In the Guido transcription above, these are just 5 bars from Chopin's Waltz in C sharp minor. Notice there are 7 sharp signs, 5 natural signs, 6 double sharp signs, plus 4 sharp signs in the key signature. Unlike most composers, Chopin used many different scales freely, and that's much to the consternation of average piano players such as myself. In fact, most popular music today, composers use 1 or 2 flats or sharps at the most. Not because it doesn't sound better, but because it's harder to read. In the Gabriel transcription below, there are no accidentals and only 1 chromatic key signature. So as I say, most composers avoid any music written in more than 2 or 3 sharps or flats because it is so hard to read, not because it doesn't sound better. Now, people like Chopin, they didn't mind writing with a lot of sharps and flats because they were experts. I mean, they were tremendous piano players. And they didn't worry about whether you could read it or not. But most modern songwriters, they use very few sharps and flats. In fact, they would probably rather use C major in all of their writing. Here is another comparison. Take a look at the Guidonian, or standard notation at the top compared to my notation on the bottom. Notice in this musical passage how the octave notes look alike in the Gabriel notation on the bottom because they repeat at the exact same staff location, whether in the bass or the treble clef, and even into the ledger lines. Since octaves sound alike, shouldn't they also look alike in the notation? However, in the Guidonian notation on top, the octave notes never repeat. Sometimes they are on a line, sometimes on a space. So now here is what a keyboard looks like, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with a piano keyboard. Keyboard design is a marvel. It's a brilliant design. If you make electronic instruments today, you don't make a, let's say, a trombone sound like a tuba, or a violin that sounds like a saxophone. You make a keyboard instrument that sounds like all of those other instruments, and in some cases even sounds like an entire orchestra. That's because this is the most simple, the most perfect way to express music. And that's because expresses the structure of music very naturally. Music is divided into white keys, or the C scale, and sharps and flats, or the black keys. But Guido's notation does not recognize this. The Guido's notation is based on the white keys only, and these are called accidentals, and they should not be. In music, the black keys are just as easy. In fact, a lot of people would say they're easier to play than white keys. Music should be written in 4 and 5 sharps and flats if it's to benefit the performer, if he could read the music. The only reason, as I say, music is not written with a lot of sharps and flats is because it's more difficult to read, not because it's more difficult to play. Music notation should be as easy to understand as this keyboard. Notice that the black and white keys are differentiated from each other by color, size, shape, and position, just like in my new Gabriel notation. Notice how octave notes are always in the same relative location. Actually, Gabriel notation is slightly better than the wonderful keyboard design because all half and whole note separations are accurate, whereas on a keyboard, the distance between E and F, for example, is the same as the distance between F and G. In other words, in some cases, half notes have the same separation as whole notes. Now here's a better example of what I was just talking about. This is four different chords, 2 in the treble clef and 2 in the bass clef. They look alike. This chord looks like this one, this chord looks like this one. They're not alike. They're completely different. Now I have printed the exact same ones in my own Gabriel notation. Notice that they don't look alike because they are not alike. Notice that there's the separation between some notes indicate a whole tone separation, some a half tone separation. You do not get that with standard Guidonian notation. Here in this close-up of Guido's notation at the left, the notes in the bass clef and the treble clef appear to be the same, but they are not, and they appear the same distance apart, but they are not. The same notes as transcribed in my Gabriel notation show that these 4 chords are comprised of different notes, and some are half-tone separations while others have whole-tone separations. So now let's look at a simplified explanation of the same thing, visual explanation. This is a G chord in Guido's treble clef, a G chord in the bass clef. Let's take a closer look. Notice that the G chord is located at the same position on the staff lines in both the bass and treble clefs in the Gabriel notation on the right, but are sometimes on a line and sometimes on a space in Guido's standard notation. The standard notation is on the left, and my new Gabriel notation, the much improved system, is on the right. Now let's take a look at the grand staff so you can see what all the notes on a keyboard look like on the new Gabriel notation system. Here is what the grand staff looks like in my new notation system. Notice that any given note always repeats at the same staff location, whether in the bass or the treble clefs. The note D, for example, is always the white rounded note between the two staff lines, which are closer together. Now, if you want to pause this video, you can take more time to see the logic of this new invention. And it is much, much easier to learn than the old standard notation, which I suffered through for many, many years. Now, I am certainly not the first to try to improve standard Guido's music notation. In fact, here's a whole book by Gardner Reed, Source Book of Proposed Music Notation Reforms. And he's got me in here, although he doesn't understand my system. He knocks it down because he doesn't understand it. And if you take a look, you'll see there are hundreds of different notations in here. People have tried for centuries to improve Guido's system. None of them have been adopted. And the reason is because none of them are superior to Guido's system. They all have some kind of problem. Mine is the only one that is superior. Basically, what people understand is that you must have a chromatic scale, because the 8 white keys in an octave on a keyboard only play C major scale, and you have to have those 5 black notes. Guido solved the problem by putting in sharps and flats. In other words, you play the same white note in the C scale, except it has to be modified. You put a sharp or a flat in front of it, or a key signature at the beginning. And it is a crime to have to remember 12 different key signatures, all the way up to 6 sharps and 6 flats. It is very discouraging for a pianist, unless you're a genius like Frédéric Chopin. Now, the key discovery of mine is that in order to get all 12 chromatic notes, or 13 if you include the octave note, into the same space as the white keys on a keyboard, the 8 white notes, you must compress the notes together. Then you don't use any more page space, and it is much more readable. You have to discard the 5 lines of Guido's system. You use the same principles that Guido did, but the arrangement is much simpler. You only have to learn 1 chromatic scale. You don't have to learn 12 different chromatic scales. And I wrote a book at the time, and I called it All Keys Are Easy, and I transcribed, this was a job, believe me, I transcribed more than 50 different pieces of music, and I remember sending out quite a few copies of this. I think I charged $10 at the time for these books, and I have a few more somewhere. What I think I am going to do to maybe revive interest in this is I'm going to get with my web manager in Australia, and I'll see if I can't print a description of this system on my website, and maybe print out some of these pieces that I have. I mean, I've already done the work. All I've got to do is to copy them over and maybe take a screenshot and print them out. And then you can understand it yourself. You can study it if you're interested. And if there is more interest, I will maybe pursue this. I mean, I already have a lot of interest. I'm saying the rosary every day at 5 p.m. And I'm also doing regular videos. But let me know if you're interested, and I will maybe try to do more videos on this. In any case, congratulate me for being 10 years on YouTube. And I hope to have my next year will be just as good as the last 10.